I share a brief story that tells about the origin of this conversation and really what we're offering, what we wanted to offer, and pulling this together with Göran. And tell a little bit about how we're going to run the conversation together. And then we'll begin with Göran and I having a dialogue for some moments. We'll have a chance after that to move into some small groups, to have a conversation for 20 minutes or so in smaller groups of people. And then to come back together in a large group, and we'll spend some time looking for patterns about what emerges when we bring all of our experiences together on this question about how we take care of the planet together. And yeah, the adrenaline has kicked in, right? The adrenaline is boosting me on this. So we do this, Göran and I, as part of also an association, a nonprofit that we're part of, which is called Happy Morphose. And the story of how we came to offering today's conversation is that Göran and I met again in October at this meeting we held on the 20th of October in honor of Alain de Villepian, a sociologist, a close friend of both of ours. We were gathered that day and thinking about Alain's work, which is very much about looking at the world, standing back and looking at it together. And that day was in French. We wanted to carry on in some way in English and connect with people internationally to offer the spirit of that conversation with more folks. And as we had that conversation, Göran said to Sean, well, what could we do? I said, well, no, what if we offered something on Zoom? And Göran, you said to me, it would be really meaningful that we look at the questions of sustainability for me, something that you've been really dedicated to for a long time. And I said, yeah, but I'm not an expert in that whatsoever. But I know I'm concerned. I'm feeling really concerned. And we said, okay, let's come with the intention to see how we can involve and engage people on that topic. And so here we are, Göran. We opened the possibility, and now more than 25 people are joining us. Wonderful. To listen to your experiences. Mainly, you've been working in that field for so long, and a little reflections from me as well, to share, and maybe to find some inspiration and hope, because it's true that when we talk about these things, it can seem, the more we know, the darker the picture seems to be.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, for this initiative. It's wonderful to be part of this group. And as you said, we had this meeting with Remembering Alain back in October. And we know that we also will have a meeting in April. Some are remembering Ari Ducheuse, and these are two people, Ari and Alain, that as far as I'm concerned, I've been in conversations with them over 40 years, really. So it's a long conversation that this is part of, and it's just wonderful that you now, with this way, invite others to tap into this, to expand this conversation, and whatever we can do. That's great. Thank you for that. And
well, thank you so much for reaching out and keeping this conversation alive and bringing it to this place. When you shared it with me, I wondered, well, am I legitimate to come to this question? I thought, well, if I'm not going to make a move now, when am I going to make a move? And I think it's in that spirit that I'm coming. And I share a little story about it. I was at the event of a friend who, like me, whose practice as a consultant, as a coach, is about helping organizations become more human, perhaps in a more living manner. And he shared with us a story the morning of the conference, which he invited us, in which he had a dream. And in his dream, he was in a conversation with his grandson, who was just born a year ago. But in the dream, his grandson was 15 years old. And his grandson said to him, Papi, granddad, you knew. And at this moment, the room went just silent, and everyone could feel his concern. And he shared with us that he was seeing the connection between well, people feeling unregulated or deregulated inside themselves, and how we're deregulated in the climate at the moment. And he decided he wanted to bring his practice in that direction. And so I decided I would like in some way to bring my practice there. But you as well, so this day is perhaps a step for me that way. You have been in this for some time. You describe yourself, and when I use the word consultant, you said, no, I'm not a consultant, Sean, I'm a pollinator. How do you work to involve all, you're a senior leader there in IKEA, senior response. How do you describe yourself to people, and what would you want to share about your experience before focusing on this, to start the conversation?
Well, it's interesting when you said that example of the grandchild. I think we all have our moments when we just feel that there is something happening, and it's really, it was so for me as well. And I left then the corporate world back in '97, so it's kind of 25 years now I've been traveling new roads. And I have a quote that was so important for me, so to say, when I lived there in Philadelphia, worked with IKEA. It was Václav Havel who happened to pass by, and he was in Philadelphia, and he said, I think there are good reason for suggesting that the modern age has ended. Today we can indicate we are going through a transitional period when something is on the way out and something else is painfully trying to be born. Something old is exhausting, crumbling and decaying itself, while something else still indistinct were arising from the rubble. And I thought that was such a poetic way of talking about the new paradigm, or the transition, or the post-industrial, all this journey again that I've been in conversation with Alain and Ari so much about. And then the question is, what is the new and what is the old? And then again, there for me, very much kind of the old is the mechanical worldview, where we have built our cars and our products, and we went to the moon and we came back, and somehow we tend to believe we are in control, in control of people or in control of nature. And of course we are not, And this new world is, of course, is very, very borderless and global and digital, but particularly very complex and interconnected. And so that's something I've really been searching for. So I felt I'd like to go out now in the world and travel new roads and start to see if I can be part of the bigger societal problems, but still believing that we have to find business solutions to them, otherwise they remain dreams. So that's kind of where I'm sitting, between living with these bigger societal issues and then how we can bring humanity or business into that. And then when I left IKEA, this has to do also with our friends, I was invited then to MIT and to Peter Senge and with Henri Ducheuse to help to lead this society for organizational learning. And then I happened to meet then with Dee Hock, the founder of Visa. And there came another, to say, quote from him. I met him, I was out in San Francisco, and it was a wonderful day, one of the best in my life, so to say, when he reflected also on his work at Visa, but also, and I'm going to share a quote from him as well, because it summarizes where I come from very much. And he said, we are at that very point in time when a 400-year-old age is rattling in its deathbed and another is struggling to be born. It's kind of the same idea as Havel. It's a shifting of culture, of science, society, and institutions enormously greater and swifter than the world ever experienced. Ahead lies the possibility of regeneration of individuality, of liberty, of community, of ethics, such as the world never had known, and a harmony with nature, with one another, and with a divine intelligence, such as the world always dreamed. And then he, of course, believed very much in forming a symbiosis between chaos and order. So his ideas of chaotic organization. So he said, chaotic we are, chaotic we will remain, chaotic the world is, and chaotic our institutions must become. It's the path to a livable future in the centuries ahead as society evolves into ever-increasing diversity and complexity. And then by ending the quote from Dee, he said, but unfortunately, ahead lies also equal possibility of massive institutional collapse, enormous social carnage, and regression to that ultimate manifestation of Newtonian, mechanistic concepts of organization, that is dictatorship. And somehow that's where I've been. I've been in that space. Where can we be on the one hand, sort of say, understanding that we have a lot of threats here. We have a lot of ideas that we have to somehow go beyond, and there is this potential. And I'm still there. There is a balance between kind of understanding the things we have around us and seeing how science tells us about where we are heading, but still somehow trying to keep hope. And that's kind of what I've tried to do for these 25 years. And it becomes very much of pollinating ideas, as you say, bringing people together, like now.
And here you are, with us, bringing people together. You reached out to me. I've not been focused on this in my career. I joined actually, the internet economy in the late 1990s, working with a dot-com startup, and then a lot of small media and technology businesses, right through to working for Google for 9 years. And Google, as a large organization, is certainly concerned about the environment, and the fact that 3,000 people are in a community there and who connected with this event through that shows that there's a concern about that. So I was aware of a growing concern and willingness for people to participate and take action on this, but I've not been focused on it in my work. And I'm really curious about the fact of what you can observe, having had this 20 years. You shared an article with me about things you wrote with Peter Senge back in, I think it was 2001, so it was just about 20 years ago, Jacques, talking about the move in mindset from the industrial age, an extractive business economy, into a regenerative, circular, life-inspired kind of economy. You're writing with great clarity 20 years ago. So I'm really curious to have shared with you observations of what has changed. What can you see? What can we point to that gives people hope? You said you're in this position, in between, with the aspirations on the one hand and looking at the realities of how to make it work through business on the other. Mm-hmm. What would you say has moved in the right direction? What have you really observed?
Well, I'd like to then take a step back and say, because I think the way I met people around the world on this issue is that if you don't have a deeper why sitting deep in our stomach, we talk about sustainability is important, but it has to go much deeper, and how that happens. I mean, you mentioned this grandchild that happened, or it can be something, but I've had, for me, say 3 pictures somehow that's been extremely important for me to somehow anchor in this why. And I might just take a minute to shorten. One is because I was leading an organization called The Natural Step, where we identified, back 20 years ago, on principles for a sustainable future. And there we presented planet Earth as a system. And if you do that, you can find, first of all, in terms of materia, it's a closed system. We are turning around the same molecules as we had 4 billion years ago. The only thing that is growing in the system is the photosynthesis, the green cell. And the only thing that comes in from outside to this planet Earth system is energy from the sun, and an enormous amount. It's just a question how we can capture it and store it. And if you accept those principles, which are not negotiable, it somehow leads you to the conclusion that the ecosystem is the mother company for us, and the economy happened to be the daughter company, and not the other way around. And I think that is so profound, and of course, then it's not only climate, it's biodiversity and all these issues. It's another way of thinking, so to say. And another kind of, for me, kind of picture here is, when we just see planet Earth, so we took the picture from outside, this wonderful blue planet Earth, we are on a spaceship. We are on a spaceship, we're traveling somewhere. And just 100 years ago, we were 2 billion on board. Well, now we are 7 billion in 100 years. And it becomes so obvious, that we have to completely rethink everything we do on, how we use the resources on the spaceship, if it's renewable or non-renewable. And then, of course, on climate is in itself. And I hope, if you haven't seen that, but because it was presented so clearly in Al Gore's book, and what was the name of that? The Terrible Truth, and I can't remember the title.
Yes, An Inconvenient Truth.
Inconvenient Truth, exactly.
Yes.
And of course, that's the data on 400,000 years back, when we know now how much the temperature had been, and we know the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we happen to have a Nobel laureate back in 1895 in Sweden, Svante Arrhenius, who came with a theory that more greenhouse gases will increase the temperature. Of course, he didn't have the data, but now we have that data. So 400,000 years. And of course, then you can say, what does it mean? Well, even if we have had 400,000 years, there has been a very stable period. We had still had 4 ice ages. But so climate can change without us, yes. But now the problem is that we have passed, 400 ppm, and we are up to 420, 230, might go into 500 pipe, and we have never been above 300 for 400,000 years. And you see, that brings us just into the climate issues, which when we start to expand temperature and we get into processes, that can unlock things that are completely out of control. So that leads us just to the question, we need a new way of thinking. And that's where I am, to solve, to quote Einstein, to solve the problems caused by the old way of thinking. So that's really exciting. How can we reconceive the world? How can we reconceive things, start to see it from another angle, And if somebody read my little opening remarks here that I did in Paris, I gave a few references there to things that I definitely would have talked with Alain if I met, things that has happened recently that is part of a reconceiving, when Paul Pullman comes, as a university with a book that is extremely important, not that it's new anything, but yes, can say, yes, it's about the stakeholder perspective, but the fact that he does it and now he does it now, I have to just to give some trust, and I like to expand that with people. I bring it to everybody. I say, okay, what does it mean? I was just a guest professor here in a business school. Said we have to redefine the school. We can't continue the way if we take this seriously. It's a reconceiving. That's kind of what I like. And we have this book by Jonathan Porritt, also Hope in Hell, and Paul Hawke. These are things that I like to give some energy to and help to pollinate. Well, that's exactly.
That was another one we shared in an article on the LinkedIn post too, about things we were reading and that we were finding inspiration. But let me challenge you, Johan, on this. I love the idea of a change in mindset and leading to aspirations for a new way of education. And actually the conference, that we're having there's a conference we'll give you information about in 7th and 8th of April in Paris, with the participation of Peter Senge, is about how we could reconceive education, living systems in education. But let me challenge you a bit, beyond the books and the thinking, what are the changes you've seen really happening? Are we observing more people moving this way? What have people done? When we read Paul Pullman's books, there's certainly evidence that things are changing in big companies.
Yes. No, it's a dramatic difference. Again, if I take my own personal journey, these 25 years being out on this issue, just 5 years ago, it was still about something to arguing about that this is important. If you're not on climate, for example, you don't have to do that really now. When I was leading the Clinton Climate Initiative back in 2007, 2008, on taking care of with 40 cities, how we can reduce greenhouse gases. At the time, we said those who don't agree with us that this is important, we don't have time to talk to them. And they were majority. That's not the case now. But my problem is that people start to, with lip service, say, oh, now it's so important. I hear it everywhere, and everybody's and it becomes so easily greenwashing, and it's not deep enough. But there again, I learned we have to get starting. And I know when you're with people and they get into the first level and say, oh, we have to go deeper. Oh, this has to do much more about that. And that's kind of the journey we are on. And don't ask me the question, will we have time? Because that's a tough one. But I still trust very much a process of I very often get the question if I can be optimistic or pessimistic from climate. I'm a truly entrepreneur and I'm very optimistic. But on the climate, I can't say that I'm optimistic because I see the tremendous challenges. I see the inertia. I see the self-interest that sits out there. But we have to be hopeful. And kind of when I remind myself of hope, I go back to the Industrial Revolution, 100 years ago or something. That was a transformation of society, but there was no plan. There was nobody leading it. How did it happen? it came out of a million small beginnings. People starting to see something different. It was a reconceiving. Of course, it was about getting out of poverty. It was about bringing new energy, blah, blah, blah. But that, it's a changing of perception among the many people. That led to the industrial. And for me, that's hopeful, because what I then do here in Gothenburg, in my small projects, or taking an environmental car, or turn up the wages here, or little Sweden, all these little things. Maybe that's the only model we have, because the alternative to that model would be a Churchill coming in with a plan for the world, and I don't think it will happen. So that's, I trust the process of the million small beginning. And on your question, the dramatic difference today, it seemed to be a new thinking coming. And I believe when we decide that this is important for real, we will start to look for solutions. And when we start to look for solutions, the human creativity, we are on Mars, as you know now, and digging and stuff, we can almost do anything. But if you don't decide that it's important, we think other things are more important. So that's kind of where I have my hope.
So I'm taking that you've noticed people are no longer arguing about this, that there is real creative attention brought to it.
Yeah. But it's a danger in that, Sean, because the fact that they don't argue doesn't mean that they are really in it, because there's so much in between here, And
yeah, so let me we want to carry on just maybe 2 or 3 minutes more, you and I, before we open up to take some questions from the group, Göran. So I'm tempted. I sort of have 2 questions coming to mind. Maybe you want to take the one which is more interest for you at this point. One is, what do you think are the kind of things that help people be more courageous together, to come together, to move towards that sort of revolution, right? And another maybe is more general, but tell me which one is more interest for you. What are the kind of conditions which, when they come together, help us move in the right direction? What are your thoughts? Is there one of those 2 questions you might like to take? Does one grab you?
Yeah, the courageous one, of course, as I like in this again, but it comes out of also this type of conversation. I mean, there are so many people today in the world, wherever I travel, being, out in China or in America, and of course not for the last 2 years, but backing it up, earlier, where people are trying to find now solutions related to these issues. And that in its, it's a movement, and it's a bottom-up movement. It won't come from top-down. And I really trust that. And again, I mentioned Václav Havel quote. I'm going to give you one more that is kind of so important for me, and it kind of way to answer your question is that, when Václav Havel, he was thrown into, he was in opposition to the Soviet regime. You remember that from the Czechoslovakian?
Yeah.
60s. And he was thrown into jail many times. And I think the 3rd time in Yale, he was asked by many people, can you still be optimistic after all these years? And now you're back in Yale. And he wrote a letter to I think his wife from this prison that is classical, and said, well, optimism, my dear friend, my dear wife, that's an expectation based on the evidence at hand that there's reasonable likelihood of a positive outcome. Optimism happened to be kind of an extrapolation. Will this work or not? But then he went on, and that's my point, and saying, but hope, my dear wife, that's something completely different. Hope is the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it might turn out. That is, you don't start with, will it succeed? You start with the question, is this important? Is this something I like to care for? And that's again where this why question and these pollinating ideas, become so instrumental. Because once kind of the why goes down in the stomach, then we'll see. But it depends what we do and how we can make it happen. So at least that's for me.
I love that way of framing it, Göran. In comparing hope and optimism, and hope is that we needed to, we will, and to bring our intention to it. I think there's something in that for me anyway about what helps me have more courage. To feel how it's important that if I have the impression we're on this beautiful blue speck, this planet, which we can see from space, one opportunity of living systems in the universe, and we're fortunate enough to be conscious of what we're experiencing, and also the changes that we've created, going from 2 billion to 7 billion. So I would wish to choose to believe that we can make a difference in this, and if we can't, that certainly we will do our best to make the difference that we can.
Yeah,
and it's in this that I find a position of somewhat, I don't know if it's recomforting, but some hope and belief. And so I sit at this moment with this question, for me, is how do we do the things we do with more courage together? What is it that makes a group feel they're capable of being more courageous in the way they act? And maybe in some small way, for me anyway, offering this experience of a conversation is acting in some way, stepping up. And it's a beginning for me. So I would love that if we can now, Göran, take some questions from the group. Would that be okay? And so we can ask people to, would that be okay for you? I'll ask people to give them in the chat. Yeah. If you can prepare, think of a question you might like to ask Göran, and me, we'll open up some time for that. And maybe Göran, while people are doing that, you might want to share what's a question that you're holding this point, at this point in with the experience you have and the hope you carry, and as you said, in this in-between place, what's a question you might like to share?
Well, I'm kind of struggling with this question. On the one hand, let's say taking science that tells us so much about what's going, particularly I think on climate, but also on biodiversity. We know so much, and it's just amazing, the data we have. But that data is scary, it's something in that, and the scientists will never be able to present that full out without somehow being able to keep some hope. And I must say, if we go into hopelessness, that may be even worse than the problems we're talking about, because when hope is gone, people vanish. And I can see this kind of tricky balance, and you can talk about when we have.
We called it the being on the
generation. Yeah.
We called it a conversation next to a bifurcation, or on the edge of a bifurcation, which means on the edge of something. Yeah. And
that brings, for me, then open question to the sort of religion, to understand people much deeper than we are. We have to understand people as people. This is not mechanical. We can't just have a solution and a scientific. We have to understand as who we are. It's a truly humanistic journey we have to understand. And that's why I made reference to Kierkegaard there. And so these are the type of question I'm struggling. And we need more humanism. We need kind of more understanding maybe of religion. Don't even have to be religious, but it's so important to understand. And that's where hope sits. And, all this thinking that goes beyond on the philosophical questions. So.
Well, thank you. So as you've been sharing that very rich question with us, received a couple of questions from the group. Agnes asked a question: what's more important to develop, hope or to develop trust in ourselves? You have a response for that one, Göran? What are your thoughts?
Well, of course, yes, of course, we need to have trust. And again, when we talk about hope, it's like somebody can say, we don't need, like you can quote by my fellow Swede, Greta Thunberg, say, we don't need hope, we need action. That's also true. But there is something even beyond that, this still needs something to go for, to hope for. And of course, trust, if you take that dimension, maybe even the most important one. Anyway, trust.
Let me take another question that comes from Camilla, Göran. This is interesting one as well. So the important things we know now, people knew 25 years ago, and it shows in the paper that you shared with me. So, she's showing her interest to know what's happened that's so little changed in 20 years. Has it?
Yeah.
And how important is it, you think, to understand this recent past to help us going forward? What are some of the things that are holding us back that we need to let go of?
Well, just to bring perspective, over the last 25 years, we have doubled the emissions of greenhouse gases, which is kind of amazing, you can say. But because 20, 30, 40 years ago, it started to be clear, let's say, from the scientific community, that we are in an Anthropocene, that we are somehow creating now these problems, I said. So this is kind of had been known, if you call it that. And still, we are so far from it. But again, it is a process of transformation. And, people can even turn it, in already 20 years, we have started to accept that we can change the climate. That's not too bad. I mean, 20 years is so then it just reframe it in another one, because and I think that's the struggle we are in. and from
Yeah, I hear something there about recognizing how long it may take for us as not just individuals, but as a society and as societies to grasp the nature and the depth and profoundness of the changes that we have brought upon the planet ourselves.
Yeah.
And not to underestimate how much it could mean that we're perhaps no longer disagreeing to the same extent. And also, and I hear the call for action and the call for moving towards things which are even more concrete. Now, a number of other questions coming up. We won't have time to take all of them.
I saw a question from Agata here, you know. And
yeah, do you want to take Agata's question?
Again, I mean, that's what kind of what we wrote in that article, you know. Of course, we have the rationalism, you know, and all that science, you know, but we need humanism and we need naturalism and we need to expand, you know, our way of seeing ourselves as being part of this bigger system. So I agree completely with that. That's why humanism and understanding people as people, and again, religion and culture and where we are, and we have to understand that, because there is no way we can do this, and it has to be in a just way. Again, there's another challenge, as you know. If you can't get people on board in the world, you know, generally it won't happen, because this is a truly global thing. So, I mean, we can talk about that later. But
well, yeah, and it's interesting that even in this group, you know, a kind of global interest has manifested, even if some of the people who have said they couldn't be here at this moment. We had an interest from India, from Nigeria, from across Europe and North America. There's a sense of people wanting to connect and talk about this subject. Maybe I'll share the question that comes from Paul. He says, you know, to move, we need a new direction. What would be a good way to summarize this new direction so it can motivate our courage? How might you summarize that, a new direction?
Well, I think that has to be something that is somehow a desirable future for us. I don't think we can come in and push people to go backwards somehow, to go into, you know, a life that is so far from where we are. It has to be something where we go towards, that we like to create. It's like I said, Martin Luther King, he said, I have a dream. He didn't say I have a nightmare, even if he was living in a nightmare. So the capacity to describe something that we want, you know, it sounds maybe a little bit ridiculous to say because it's obvious, but it sits there very much. How can we define something? And I can come back later, by the way, in our conversations, refer back to this Paul Hawkins book, Regeneration. It's one, and Paul, this is some very interesting way of framing it exactly that way, you know, that it's not about solving the climate problem, it's about building a world that is more just and that we like to live in. Then, of course, the outcome will be also the solving climate problems.
Can I maybe share one last question? I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of the questions that have come up now, but this is an interesting one from Steen, who remembers a conversation he had in a taxi with you years ago when he said people need to understand that we must use new sun, not old sun. And he asks if so, what have you seen that's changed, and what do we see really concretely different in the corporate world? I think Paul Pullman's book gives some very specific examples from his experience. What are a couple of things that you might mention that have really seen change concretely?
No, but I mean, if now Sten, wonderful to hear him again from Denmark, from Copenhagen, again on new energy instead of old. Of course, what we see, it's a revolution in terms of course, solar energy and wind. It's just unbelievable. I mean, going back to my own little country here, now what's in pipeline from wind, it will outgrow rapidly now nuclear and hydro. It's on a scale that you guys 5 years ago was impossible just to expect, you know. So extrapolations doesn't work once we let it go. So, and that's kind of where I had my hope, you know. Yeah, not a naive hope, but still some hope.
Yes. Well, but there has been progress in technology at times, which is certainly non-linear.
No, not at all.
Yes.
But of course, then we are sitting with the also experience that solutions of today, there might be problems of tomorrow. So it's complex. We know that. We have to be humble.
So thank you, Göran. I'm sitting in one of those moments of in between, like you say, because I would love to at once to continue with this and take on more questions and give us more opportunity to answer. At the same time, I want to give everyone who has joined here the opportunity to move into a small group and have a conversation in a space where you can listen to each other and each have a chance to share on the basis of what we've discussed so far, what's come up. What do you think and what do you feel about that? What resonates with you? And perhaps also to share in your smaller group, how am I an actor in these changes? So that you get a sense of who's there in the conversation with you, how you're concerned and what are you bringing into that? Would that be okay? So I'm going to put those two questions as a guide for you into the chat, so you can give a think to those questions for about a minute or so, just in quiet, gather your thoughts, and then we're going to move you into groups when Sophie says she's ready. I'll check with you, Sophie. Okay, so let me just bring those questions into the chat so you can have a look at them. And our invitation here in this time is to seize the opportunity to listen, to be present with each other, discover another set of perspectives from some people who have come sharing the interest in this conversation. And we're going to give you 20 minutes in those groups, which we hope will allow you time first just to introduce yourselves quickly, and then to have a time to listen to each one of you for 3 minutes or so. You'll be in groups of 4, there may be one group of 3 or so. And then at the end, after you've listened to everybody, perhaps you might take a few minutes, if you could, to just ask yourselves, what's come up for us in the middle of what we've each shared. And we'll have a time to come back and to invite you to share what you might wish to. There will not be any formal reporting back, but you'll have a chance to share what you might wish to share with the group. That might be useful for everybody to hear. We'll bring our attention to looking for that and looking for any patterns that might come up in what you've shared in the smaller groups. Okay, so Sophie, you're saying that, so listening to the conversation so far, what resonates for me? What do I think and feel about what was just shared? And how am I an actor in supporting sustainability myself? Am I part of this? Okay, so a couple of questions, just leave you 30 seconds to reflect on that if you wish. And then Sophie, in about 30 seconds, will send us into the groups. We won't have to do anything. Normally we'll just show up there.